She's still holding his sleeve. Mirabelle Chen had walked into emergency bays in the middle of the night more times than she could count. She had seen a great many things. She had not seen Celeste Drummond, who had once ended a board meeting by calmly correcting a senior partner's math without looking up from her notes. Lying in a hospital bed in a gown, gripping a stranger's jacket sleeve like it was the only solid thing left in the room. The man in the chair beside her was wearing a tuxedo that had seen better hours. His collar was open. There was a faint trace of road dust on his cuff, the one not currently occupied by Celeste's hand. He was sitting very still, watching the monitors with the particular focus of someone who had once been paid to track vital signs and had never quite stopped. Mirabelle looked at Celeste. She looked at him. She looked at the hand. "Wait," she said quietly. "Is he the one you never told me about?" "Do your job," Celeste said immediately. "I am doing my job. Your oxygen saturation is 94 and climbing." Mirabelle picked up the chart, but she was still smiling. "You've been in emergency bays before. You've never held anyone's sleeve." The man said nothing. He reached over and adjusted the blanket where it had shifted off her shoulder. The gesture was entirely automatic, the kind of thing a person does without deciding to, and it was somehow worse than if he had said something. If you're the kind of person who needs to know how a story ends before you'll commit to it, subscribe now. Because this one takes a few turns before it gets where it's going, and you won't want to miss them. Adrian Okonkwo had learned, years before anyone hired him to do it, that staying calm in a crisis was not a personality trait. It was a skill. He had developed it the same way he had developed most useful things, out of necessity, in the kind of conditions that didn't leave room for anything else. He had spent 11 years as a paramedic in Ottawa. He had run calls in the Glebe and Vanier, on Rideau Street in January and on the Queensway in summer fog. He knew how quickly a situation could move from manageable to irreversible, and he knew this was the part that mattered. How to close the gap between those two states before it became something no one could walk back from. He had left the ambulance service 3 years ago, after his wife Raina died from a stroke that moved faster than anyone had anticipated. He was 40. Their daughter Willa was 7. She had her mother's quiet way of watching the world and her father's habit of asking the kind of question that made adults pause before answering. After Rena died, Willa had started watching Adrian the way children watch parents they are not certain of keeping. She didn't say anything. She just watched. He needed work with a schedule, work that would not put him on the road at 2 in the morning and unavailable for school pickups and science fair projects and the small, ordinary moments that were, he had come to understand, the actual substance of a childhood. The position at the Drummond Health Foundation appeared in his search results on a Thursday, Director of Community Operations, a role managing the foundation's grant relationships with regional hospitals and outpatient clinics across eastern Ontario. He applied without much expectation and was hired within a week. What he had not been prepared for was Celeste Drummond. She ran the foundation with the kind of precision that looked effortless only to people who had never attempted it. She remembered the name of every hospital administrator she'd ever spoken to, their operating budgets, their most recent accreditation results, and the specific funding gap that had brought them to her in the first place. She worked 12-hour days, as a matter of course, and apologized to no one for it. She noticed Adrian the same way she noticed most things, by paying attention when it would have been easier not to. She noticed that he filed reports without being reminded, that when she asked a question in a meeting he gave her the actual answer, rather than a comfortable approximation of it, that he kept a spare phone charger in his desk drawer because the boardroom outlets were always occupied, and she invariably arrived for a 6 o'clock conference call with her battery at 11%. He had observed her need for it exactly twice and filed it away. He never mentioned it. She noticed that his voice changed when Willa called. He didn't take personal calls at his desk, but sometimes Willa called the office line when her mobile wouldn't connect, and the change in him was immediate. His whole body seemed to slow down, to move at a different frequency, as though he became in those moments a person who existed at a pace the rest of the working week couldn't accommodate. She had heard it twice and told herself it was relevant professional context. She told Mirabelle something slightly different, that her director of community operations was unusually capable and she was considering restructuring his reporting line. Mirabelle had listened to 4 months of this kind of framing before she said anything. "You've mentioned how he handles stakeholder calls 3 times this week," she said one evening. "The last time was to describe how he stood up during a presentation." I was making a point about presence under pressure. You described how he stood up, Celeste. It was a relevant observation. Celeste. Mirabel let it go and started listening more carefully after that. The Drummond Foundation Gala was held in late October at the Shaw Center. 300 guests, a live orchestra, and a keynote address Celeste had been refining for 2 weeks. The centerpiece was the Foundation's new Equitable Access Initiative, a commitment to direct funding for community hospitals in rural and low-income urban communities across Ontario that had been consistently bypassed by provincial allocation formulas. It was the kind of program Celeste's father would have championed. It was also the kind of program that a man named Warren Fitch had been trying to quietly kill for 6 months. Warren was the Foundation's CFO, smooth, long-tenured, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who had been in an organization long enough to mistake familiarity for indispensability. He had been running a secondary operation alongside his official role, redirecting grant funds through a network of shell vendors, supplying affiliated hospitals with medical equipment that had been pulled from certified distribution, devices that had failed internal safety testing, been quietly delisted, then relabeled and moved into circulation at a discount through channels that no one with authority had ever thought to audit. The Equitable Access Initiative would require a full supply chain review. Warren could not survive a supply chain review. He handed Celeste a glass of sparkling water backstage 40 minutes before she was due at the podium. Said the catering staff had sent it over. Said she hadn't eaten since noon, which was true. It was a precise observation. Warren was, above all else, a precise man. Celeste drank the water. She felt the pressure across her chest first. A tightening, she told herself, was nerves. Then couldn't tell herself anything because the light from the chandeliers had begun to behave in a way that light was not supposed to behave. Her hand found the edge of the podium. She heard a glass fall from somewhere very far away. Then a voice, low, certain. Celeste, look at me. Adrian had been watching from the side of the room. He had noticed she was pale when she came backstage. A particular kind of pale he recognized from 11 years of arriving at situations before anyone else was ready for them. He had been watching her since she walked to the podium, and when her hand reached for the edge of it, he was already moving. He reached her in seconds, checked her pulse, checked her breathing. He knew the timeline. He had watched her take the water at 23 minutes to 8. It was now 7 minutes past. He called for the venue's emergency kit. When it arrived, he opened Celeste's evening bag for the antihistamine auto-injector her physician had prescribed years ago for a shellfish sensitivity. The device was expired by 14 months. He used the kit's injector instead. The ambulance was delayed. A collision on Colonel By Drive had shut down the nearest cross street. 35-minute wait. Adrian did not wait. He carried her himself through 300 people who had been watching their host collapse and now watched a man in a tuxedo carry her through the lobby of the Shaw Center. Because sometimes the most useful thing a person can do is act before the room has finished being surprised. Celeste was semi-conscious through most of the drive to the Queensway Carleton. She knew it was Adrian because of his voice, low and even, telling her to stay with him, telling her she was fine, saying her name with a steadiness that felt like a decision rather than a reflex. At some point, she found the sleeve of his jacket. She held on. She didn't let go when the triage team moved her to a bay. She didn't let go when Mirabel came through the door at something close to a run and stopped in the doorway, taking in the room. Mirabel looked at the monitors. She looked at the IV line. She looked at Celeste's hand and at the man sitting in the chair beside the bed, entirely composed, collar open, road dust on the cuff she wasn't holding. She's still holding his sleeve, Mirabel said. And then, quietly, a laugh. Wait, is he the one you never told me about? Do your job, Celeste said immediately. I am doing my job. Your oxygen saturation is 94 and climbing. Mirabel picked up the chart. You have been in emergency bays before. You have never held anyone's sleeve. Adrian said nothing. He reached over and adjusted the blanket where it had shifted off her shoulder. The gesture was completely automatic. The kind of thing a person does without deciding to, and it was somehow worse than anything he could have said. He's my director of community operations, Celeste said. I know, you mentioned his filing system 3 weeks ago, with some enthusiasm. It was an unusually well-organized system. Mirabel looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at the wall. Go home, Celeste told him. Willa needs you. He looked at her then, steady, unhurried. She's with the Nguyens next door. I'll go when you tell me you're actually planning to sleep and not discharge yourself the moment the attending steps out. That's not your decision. No, he agreed, it's not. He didn't move. Celeste looked away first. He found it before he left. He had gone to retrieve her evening bag from where the nurses had set it aside, intending to check her phone and pull up her morning schedule before heading out. When he looked more carefully at the expired auto-injector, something made him examine the casing. The lot number didn't exist anywhere in the Foundation's procurement records. He knew those records. He had audited them 6 weeks ago as part of the Equitable Access Program's baseline documentation. This device had not come through their system. Someone had switched it. He stood in the hospital corridor for a long moment, turning that over. Then he walked back to Mirabelle. Before she's discharged, did you run a full toxicology screen? Mirabelle studied him. Standard protocol, why? Her reaction accelerated faster than environmental exposure would explain. Someone gave her something to drink right before she went on stage. He placed the auto-injector on the counter. I think you should hold the blood sample. Don't release it with the standard discharge file. Mirabelle looked at the device. That requires patient authorization. I know. Give me 2 minutes. He went back in. He explained what he had found in 3 sentences. The lot number, what it suggested, what holding the sample would require Celeste to sign. She was exhausted and still slightly unfocused, but she understood enough to authorize it without argument. At the door, he stopped. He had a choice that looked clean on the surface and wasn't. His role ended at professional hours, and the sensible thing, the thing that protected Willa, that protected him, was to go home and let the systems handle the rest. Instead, he stood there thinking about a lot number that didn't exist, and about a CFO who had handed Celeste a glass of water and smiled at her in a way that Adrian had catalogued 3 hours ago as something other than collegial. He turned around. I need access to the Foundation's vendor procurement records, he said, the last 2 years. I need you to know that before anyone asks you to sign anything in the next 48 hours. Celeste looked at him for a long time. All right, she said. Warren moved on a timeline. Within 2 days, he had quietly convened an informal session with 3 sympathetic board members, framing Celeste's collapse as evidence of sustained executive overreach and suggesting the Equitable Access Initiative had been driving an unsustainable pace. He used the phrase health-related withdrawal twice. He attributed it to no one specific. Adrian relayed the summary to Celeste in 4 sentences. She was back at her desk in a suit that gave no indication she had been unconscious on a stage, and she listened without expression. They're suggesting I step back from the initiative. That's what the language implies. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not stepping back. I know, he said. He placed a folder on her desk. Inside were procurement records going back 22 months with 4 lot numbers circled in red. She looked at them. She looked at him. You were up all night. I slept, he said. She didn't believe him. She opened the folder. The records told a story that took her 20 minutes to read and considerably longer to accept. The lot numbers Adrian had flagged corresponded to a batch of monitoring devices, pulse oximeters, portable ECG units, infusion pumps, that had been quietly removed from the Foundation's certified vendor list 14 months ago. No recall notice, no documented defect. The units had simply disappeared from the active inventory. The accounting entries replaced by corrected figures that made the numbers balance without explaining where the equipment had gone. They didn't destroy them, Adrian said. No, she closed the folder, they sold them. She thought about the Equitable Access Initiative, about the hospitals she had been preparing to fund, small facilities in northern Ontario and the outskirts of Greater Montreal, places without procurement departments or legal teams or the infrastructure to trace a faulty device back to its source. She thought about what it meant if someone inside this foundation had already been supplying those hospitals with delisted equipment, pocketing the difference, and using her charitable program as cover. She thought about Warren, who had been dismantling the program's budget for half a year, and about the glass of water she had accepted without once asking where it had come from. I want the secondary storage documentation, she said, the off-site warehouse logs. I already submitted the access request, Adrian said. She looked at him. This morning, he said, before you came in. The warehouse was in the industrial corridor east of the city. registered to a numbered company that traced back through two intermediary firms to a holding structure Warren had established 7 years ago. They went in the evening using Celeste's authorization credentials and a legitimate audit justification Adrian had drafted. The equipment was there, all of it, repackaged, relabeled, staged for distribution. He cross-referenced 3 lot numbers against the deleted procurement entries. They matched. He was photographing the shipping manifests when his phone buzzed. The facility's after-hours monitoring service had flagged the interior motion sensor. The account was registered to Warren Fitch. They moved. Adrian transferred what he could onto a portable drive, distribution logs, relabeling records, shipping manifests, and they were out in under 4 minutes. As they pushed through the exit, he caught sight of 2 compact camera housings mounted near the back wall, angled to cover the storage area. Interior cameras, he hadn't seen them on the way in. Warren would have the footage within the hour. In the car, Celeste sat very still, watching the city pass in the dark. "They were going to let me announce that program," she said, "in front of 300 people, while they were already running this." Adrian didn't answer. It wasn't a question. "They would have used my name," she said, "to distribute defective equipment to hospitals that can't afford to fight back." A pause. I took the water without thinking. He handed it to me, and I didn't hesitate, not for a second. The car was quiet. "I've questioned every budget line and every board appointment for 9 years," she said, "and a glass of water from a man I've never fully trusted. I just took it." She looked at the window. "Because you're the person I don't question. You say something and I believe it. I'm not sure when that started." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to finish that." "I want to." She kept her eyes on the glass. "You're the first person I've trusted without deciding to. It just happened, and I've spent my whole career making decisions I could document and defend, and this was the one thing I couldn't calculate my way into or out of." She paused. "I don't know what to do with something I can't calculate." He was quiet for a long moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that you do what you do with every situation you don't have a framework for." She waited. "You stay with it," he said, "and see what it becomes." Warren had the footage by morning. By noon, it had reached 2 journalists. By afternoon, 2 digital outlets were running the phrase "professional boundary concerns" alongside the name of the foundation's director of community operations, described as a man with an irregular personal relationship with the CEO. Adrian read the coverage at his desk without expression. Celeste came out of her office and closed the door. "Don't," he said before she could speak. "I'm not going to say what you think I'm going to say." She stood in front of his desk. "Every person I've worked with in 9 years has looked at a difficult situation and decided what I needed and acted on it before asking me. You are not allowed to do that. Not you." He looked at his screen. The resignation draft had been open for 2 hours. "Willa could end up in the coverage if this escalates." "Then we end it before it escalates." Her voice was even precise, the voice of someone who had thought this through before walking out of her office. "I'm asking you to trust me the same way you trusted that I would sign the sample authorization at 11 o'clock at night when I was barely coherent. I signed it because you asked. I'm asking." The words sat between them and didn't move. He thought about Willa, who had asked him 3 nights ago why he seemed different lately. "Not tired," she'd said. "More like you're paying attention to something." He had not answered because he didn't have a clean way to finish that sentence either. He closed the draft without submitting it. That evening, Willa sat at the kitchen table with her geography project and watched her father make dinner. After a while, she said, "Are you going to leave the foundation?" He turned from the stove. "What makes you ask?" "You have your deciding face on." He turned back. "Is it because of Ms. Drummond?" she asked. "It's complicated." Willa was quiet in the way she was quiet when something mattered enough to choose her words carefully. "Is it complicated because you don't want to stay? Or because you do and you think you're not supposed to?" He didn't answer. Willa went back to her project, a color-coded map of Ontario's Northern Health Corridor, annotated with population data she had pulled from Statistics Canada. She had gotten the idea, she'd explained, from listening to her father talk about his work. He looked at his daughter, bent over her coloring pencils with the same focused patience she had inherited from her mother, and understood something that should perhaps have been obvious before now. The version of himself that used responsibility as a reason to stop moving was a version she could see straight through. "I'm not leaving," he said. Willa didn't look up. "Good." Warren made his final move 3 days before the board vote. He came to Celeste's office mid-morning, measured and quiet, and explained that if she continued to pursue the investigation, he had the connections within the provincial regulatory body to ensure that the Foundation's operating charter review reflected certain questions about executive conduct. He called it a courtesy. He said he wanted her to understand her options clearly. After he left, she sat alone for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Mirabel. "I need everything you have," Celeste said, in the right order. A pause. "How much time do you have?" "However long it takes." Mirabel had not released the blood results yet. She had been waiting for secondary confirmation from an independent toxicology service, a private laboratory she used in cases where she anticipated the standard results would be challenged. She had made that decision the same night Adrian handed her the expired auto-injector, and she had documented Celeste's authorization for the extended sample hold before Celeste left the building. The independent confirmation had come back 40 hours ago. The compound in Celeste's blood was a synthetic sensitizing agent, a chemical accelerant designed to amplify the body's response to an existing allergen, producing acute anaphylaxis in someone who would otherwise experience only mild discomfort. Its primary commercial applications were in the calibration of allergy response monitoring systems. Monitoring systems produced under a manufacturing license, registered to the same numbered company that held the warehouse lease. It was never just about the equipment, Mirabel said. No, Celeste said. It wasn't. They had needed her incapacitated, or worse, if the auto-injector hadn't been switched before the initiative launched and triggered the audit it would require. Mirabel, I have chain of custody on the sample. I have your independent report. I have the original hospital panel. Yes. What I need is the distribution documentation from the warehouse. The drive, Mirabel said. Adrian has the drive. She drove to his apartment that night. Willa answered the door, looked at her, looked somewhere behind her toward her father, and said without ceremony, "I'll do my homework in my room." They sat at the kitchen table and ran the recovery sequence. 68% of the files had survived. The distribution logs were intact. The shipping manifests were intact. The relabeling records were partially corrupted but recoverable enough to establish the pattern clearly. 6 shipments, months, to 19 hospitals. All of them small, all of them under-resourced, none of them likely to have the infrastructure to identify the source of a failing device. Celeste was quiet for a long moment, looking at the screen. Then, Willa. Willa appeared in the doorway immediately, in a way that suggested she had not gone very far. "There's a folder on my tablet," Willa said. "It's been there for a few weeks. I didn't put it there." Adrian was very still for a moment. Then, the evening at the office. 3 weeks ago when I needed to move a file quickly before a call and you had your tablet with you. He looked at Celeste. "I forgot to delete it." Celeste opened the folder. It contained the section of the distribution log that had been most corrupted on the main drive. The earliest shipments. The ones that established the timeline with the greatest precision. The ones that connected the first falsified procurement entries to the first delivery receipts. Intact, untouched. Sitting on a 10-year-old's homework tablet because her father had been in a hurry 3 weeks ago and moved on without cleaning up after himself. Celeste sat back in her chair. She thought about a compound in her blood and its connection to a manufacturing license registered to a numbered company. She thought about what happened when powerful men underestimated the things they'd had decided were not worth watching. "Willa," she said quietly, "don't close that file." The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Thursday. Celeste arrived at 8:45 with Mirabel, a lawyer she had retained the previous afternoon, and a communications consultant she had called the evening before. She did not go to the boardroom. She went to the main floor atrium, where the building's event space had been legitimately reserved, and set up for a press briefing at 9:15. Warren's assistant called at 9 o'clock to ask why she was in the building. She didn't answer. At 9:15, Mirabel stood before 11 journalists and presented the toxicology findings in plain language. The compound, its industrial applications, its connection to the manufacturing license registered to the numbered company. She presented the chain of custody, the independent laboratory report, and the original hospital panel. She stated facts and answered questions. At 9:40, Celeste's lawyer presented the distribution records. He named the hospitals. He named the lot numbers. He named the dates of every shipment over 16 months. At 9:53, representatives from two of the affected hospitals confirmed on record that the lot numbers matched equipment currently in active use on their wards. Warren came downstairs at 10:15. He stood at the back of the atrium and looked at the cameras, at the lawyer, at Celeste standing to the side of the room with her hands at her sides, watching him with an expression that held no anger, only clarity. The particular steadiness of someone who has spent a week being certain and is finally standing somewhere that certainty costs them nothing. "You're burning down 9 years of work," he said. "I'm burning down what you built inside 9 years of work," she said. "There's a difference." He held her gaze. He looked past her at the cameras, at the lawyer who had picked up his phone. He walked out. He was met in the parking structure by two officers from the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, contacted by Celeste's lawyer the previous morning once the evidentiary chain was complete. A second team was at the same moment visiting the offices of the numbered company's registered director, a man named Clifford Mott, whom they found already in possession of a travel itinerary. The charges covered fraud, distribution of unregulated medical devices, and criminal negligence endangering patient safety across 2 provinces. The case would take months to prosecute. Neither man returned to the foundation. The board voted to reaffirm Celeste's executive authority that afternoon. The vote was not close. She accepted the reinstatement with 2 conditions, in writing: a full independent safety audit of every hospital that had received equipment through Warren's network, and the establishment of a supply chain oversight committee with authority that bypassed executive approval, reported directly to the full board. Both conditions were accepted before 4 o'clock. Adrian's name was cleared within 72 hours. The articles that had run about him were quietly amended once the full story broke. The retractions were brief. The originals had been considerably less so. He did not return to his previous role. Celeste had offered it. He declined. "It's not because of what happened," he said. They were in her office, late afternoon, the Ottawa River visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the flat gray light of a November day. "The Oversight Committee needs someone who understands both sides, how procurement works from inside an institution and how it's supposed to work on paper. I know both." "You'd report to the board directly," she said. "Yes. Not to me. Not to you." She was quiet for a moment. "That's practical." "It is." She looked back at the river. He moved toward the door. "Adrian," she said. He stopped. "In the car," she said, when I didn't finish the sentence. She kept her eyes on the window. "I was going to say that you're the first person I've been around where I didn't have to manage the distance, where I couldn't calculate how close was safe and whether what I felt was something I could afford." A pause. "I've been running the numbers on every relationship I've had since I was 23 years old, every single one. And this one I couldn't calculate. I tried." He was very still. "I don't know what to do with something I can't calculate," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "I think you do the same thing you do with every situation you don't have a framework for." She waited. "You stay with it," he said, "and see what it becomes." Willa's geography presentation was on a Saturday morning in the school gymnasium. Folding tables, hand-lettered display boards, and the particular smell of a building that had been overheated to accommodate parents who had dressed for November weather and been surprised by November weather regardless. Celeste arrived without advance notice and without any professional reason to be there. She wore a coat and flat boots and found Willa's display in the second row without needing anyone to point her to it. The project was meticulous for a 10-year-old, a detailed map of Ontario's northern health corridor, annotated with population-to-physician ratios, hospital bed counts, and average patient travel times to specialist care. At the bottom, in careful block letters that had been gone over twice to make them straight, Willa had written, "For the hospitals that don't get enough, made with my dad and Ms. Drummond's data." Celeste stood in front of it for a long moment. "The legend was the hardest part," Willa said, appearing beside her. "Dad said you'd want to know the technical part first." "He was right," Celeste said. "How did you decide on the color coding?" "I used the Foundation's reporting palette from last year's impact document. Dad had it saved." Willa tilted her head slightly, entirely untroubled. "He talks about the Foundation at dinner, not all the time, just when something interesting happened." A pause. "He talks about you more than he talks about the Foundation, though, in case you were wondering." Celeste said nothing. "It's okay," Willa said, with the particular equanimity of a child who has observed a great deal and decided most of it is fine. "He smiles differently when he says your name. Mom used to make him smile like that too." She looked at the map. "I like it when he smiles like that." That evening, Adrian took Celeste to a restaurant she had never heard of, a small Ghanaian place on a side street in the glebe. 12 tables, a chalkboard menu, the kind of room where the heat came from the kitchen and the noise was honest and nobody was performing anything. "No board members," he said when they sat down. I noticed. "No press." Also noticed. "No reason to leave early." He looked at her across the small table. She looked back. "Is this a date?" He considered the question with the same unhurried attention he gave to most things. "Only if you're not planning to introduce me as your oversight committee chair." She reached across the table and took his hand. She held it the way she had held his sleeve in the emergency bay, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but with the simple, unfamiliar ease of a woman who had spent half her life calculating the cost of staying close to someone and had finally stopped doing the math. "Then let me introduce you," she said, "as the first person I ever stopped calculating." He looked at her hand in his. He looked at her face. He didn't say anything for a long moment because some things don't require a response so much as they require a person to hold still and let them be true. Outside, it was a November night in Ottawa, cold and ordinary, the kind the city produces without ceremony. Unremarkable to anyone who hadn't spent the last 3 weeks in a slow emergency that had become, in the space of a small restaurant on a side street, something else entirely. Celeste Drummond had spent 20 years accumulating power that got documented in annual reports and cited at industry conferences. She had built something real, what she had not understood, what it took a 10-year-old's geography project, and a doctor who laughed at exactly the right moment, and a man who kept choosing to come back into the room, was that the only version of power worth anything is the kind used for something larger than yourself. Adrian hadn't changed her. He had simply been the first person in a long time who made her feel safe enough to be who she already was. And that, if you are the kind of person who pays attention to the small things, is the only part of this story worth holding on to. Not the investigation or the arrests or the press briefing in the atrium. The smaller truth underneath all of it, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is let someone stay. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Echoes of Memory. There are a lot more where this one came from, and next week's is already waiting.